Good morning, everyone. I'm afraid I'm a little bit. The pollens have gotten to me, as I'm sure they're getting to you. It's that time of the year in Gauteng. And then this is when you remember the reason why you have such beautiful sunsets in Gauteng is because of the pollution of it. It's enviable. There are not too many places in the world that have purples and lilacs and indigos like we do. But that's the price we pay for the heavy metals. Pari's I'm sorry if you didn't know that. Because if you didn't know that, then ignorance would have been bliss. I apologize for that. Pari's presentation is always really entertaining. I love his stories, actually. I sometimes get lost in his stories and try to work out the connection between his story and the point he's making. I can't say I always find it, but I usually do. But he adds such a richness to something we often ignore as boring and things somebody else should do and somebody else should pay attention to, and has made statistics with his team from Stats SA live and breathe for us. I have to say I'm quite enviable of their building. And I'd like to know how they got the budget for that building while the rest of us struggle. Okay, colleagues, I've got a few slides I want to take you through. I'm not sure it's on point to the question you asked, but you asked a very difficult question about how public research institutions in particular should respond to the SDGs. So I have a series of musings, if you like, that point in that direction. But there are some very big considerations at hand around it. And the point I'd like to begin is this one. Is the SDGs are a milestone in a journey. They cannot be an end in themselves. One of the difficult lessons we learned around the Millennium Development Goals is that while many people around the world came not too far from achieving them, their ability to sustain it was not there, primarily because it wasn't operating within a development framework. It was driven in its own right as individual things that had to be achieved, whether or not you achieved anything else. And a very big part of this discussion has been around the discussion of the role of the donors. Because we had an MDG agenda in the South that was driven by donors, and very few by national agendas. Now in the South African instance, it was driven by a national agenda. But you know, we're one of the few countries in the developing world that control our entire budget. So in the discussions that are happening around the SDGs, around the ways and means to achieve the SDGs, this is a strong part of the discussion. The role of the national entities and the role of the external entities and how they interact. The second thing is that the SDGs, as ambitious as they are, and they're incredibly ambitious, only achieve the baseline. They only cater to the basic needs. It isn't about prosperity yet. It isn't really about planet yet. And it isn't really a fulfillment of people yet. But it is the beginning. So we must understand that we have to develop good national products that organize for us to build the kind of economy that we want to, within which the SDGs organize for us to have a better quality of life. Now South Africa has something like this. We call it the NDP. Actually it's a suite of things. It's the NDP and the New Growth Path and a series of other things. So we have a suite. But many places in the world do not. The second thing is to understand that in the way we deal with the SDGs, we have to have the longer term view. And the immediate longer term view, I recognize the irony in that statement, is 2050. And in 2050 we have to deal with something called the 10 billion initiative. It is estimated that the world's population in 2050 will be 9.7 billion people. That is a very gigantic number. It's also estimated that in 2050, the most populous continent on Earth will be Africa. So there is a very special challenge associated with it. So I think if we contextualize the SDGs within a much broader framework, we're already going to be better off. I've just returned from Stockholm, from the World Water Week, and the week was dominated with this discussion. And it's incredibly worrying that most of the developing world is not actually in the same conversation. It's still in the conversation of chasing the target, the stuff that Paddy was talking to, the stuff of evil, if you like, because there's a built-in non-sustainability within that. So in the way we're thinking about this, we have to think about where we actually want to be. And this is a representation, a very bad representation, of the cone of uncertainty, but my PowerPoint skills are limited. I'm working on that. And the point is that we're starting at a point of certainty now around what we know. And as we go into the future, that cone of uncertainty becomes larger and larger and larger, of course. So when we're looking at the SDGs, we have options. We can have a green pathway around the sustainability that I'm sure you've been talking about for the last 2 days. Or we can have a red pathway, because it is possible to achieve many of the SDGs without consideration of the environment, without consideration of climate change, and without consideration of sustainability. We already have done that with the MDGs. It is possible to repeat that all over again. So we have to now set our sights on the kind of pathway that we want to follow in achieving the SDGs and eventually going to the 10 billion initiative. Hopefully we've done enough between now and then around the education of women and the girl child, etc., so that it does not become the 10 billion initiative, that it becomes maybe the 8 billion initiative. But let's see how we go. And of course, in the nature of futures, there are many futures that are possible. It's not only the green pathway and the red pathway, but a whole range in between. But the key thing about the future is not predicting it, but organizing to think about it in such a way that one organizes for, firstly, the robustness of your strategy to withstand that future. But secondly, once you start thinking about the future in a particular way, you've already instituted a bias. You have set yourselves the target around what you want to achieve, and this is really important. So let's talk to the SDGs. This is the most commonly stolen icon from Google nowadays. The rule, incidentally, because they give you a little booklet that says how you should use this logo. Have you seen that? Yeah. And it tells you who to acknowledge and how to acknowledge it and so forth. So I acknowledge all who need to be acknowledged in that booklet. Okay. So I think we're on safe ground now. No, the SDGs themselves are a complex mixture of things. There are some that are very direct targets around basic needs, water, energy, basic nutrition, basic health. There are a range of enabling factors to make all of this happen. The issues of decent work around the economic development pathway, etc. There are direct policy pushes without any detail that are crucially important, that we are refusing to unpack. We are 2 years into this SDG pathway. We're refusing to unpack some very important things, one of which is the patterns of consumption and production in the world. It's not just about the reduction of consumption and changing your production methods from red to green. It is about what is consumed where and what is produced where. And this is a discussion that the haves in the world are avoiding. It's a discussion on whose door we should be knocking very strongly. But the overall banner around this thing, around the SDGs, if one had to pull out one thing as the indicator, it is the first one. It is organizing our efforts collectively to have a general absence of poverty in the world. And if we combine that with SDG number 17, it says this is how we do it. We do it in partnership. So if you're not going to remember anything else around the 17 SDGs, remember those two. We're moving towards a world of no poverty, a very difficult pathway, we have to admit to ourselves, and we want to do it in the spirit of partnership. Now, I want to unpack this thing in another way, because there's a parallel conversation that happens in the world. It's not the folks sitting in this room, it's the folks sitting in this room at other periods of time, and this is business South Africa and business world. The business world is also looking at the risks around the global economy. The World Economic Forum is one of those places that does it quite regularly. Every January without fail, the Global Risk Register comes out. The Précis version is available to you to download free of charge. If you want the detail, you're going to have to pay someone for it. And this is what they put out as the Global Risk Register for 2017. Now, the stuff that's in the Global Risk Register is, of course, pretty interesting. Yancy says I can use this. Right. So, some of the things are very familiar to you. You know about the issues associated with climate change. You know about the notion of the water crisis in the world. You know about the issues of migration. And these all cluster themselves into this quadrant. This quadrant is the quadrant of high likelihood and high impact. Okay? Now, there are some that, of course, are going to be reassessed in a very interesting way. That one there, which is high impact but very low likelihood, is around the threat of the weapons of mass destruction. And, of course, the discussions that have been happening beyond, well, not happening between, but happening among Pyongyang and Washington in the last couple of months are telling us that that thing there is probably going to be somewhere there. Unless, of course, there's an intervention that helps to organize the world in a different space. Now, this is how the business world is thinking about the risks going into the future. Interestingly, if you then overlay that with the SDGs, you find some very interesting parallels. Because every single one of those risks, not only in this quadrant, but in the entire risk register, is related very directly to at least one SDG, and in many cases, more than one SDG. Some are very obvious, of course. The water crisis in the world is related to SDG number 6 around water and sanitation. The extreme weather events and the natural disasters around the climate action SDG 13, but some a little bit further away, like the acid bubbles, are associated with the economic models. It's associated with the work situation in the world. But all of them, without fail, even the ones related to peace and governance, all find themselves in this risk register. And yet the irony of the 5 years leading up to the SDGs, because there was a massive global consultation, probably bigger than there was ever before. And then 2 years after that, there is a general absence of the private sector in any of these discussions. So the NSTF is one of those vehicles that we have, Yancy, in South Africa that brings this partnership together. It's a great place to have this discussion in a lot more depth.